People who are experienced at dealing with conflict often have a lifetime of skills that they learn over time through trial and error. There is, however, a framework that you can apply to managing conflict. This is something that's taught in a range of areas, and I've done training with people who are lawyers, police, hostage negotiators, and unfortunately in medicine, that kind of training isn't something that you typically find. Today I'm going to run through some of those frameworks and an approach to dealing with conflict that you can use consistently throughout your career, and one that you can build on your skills each time it occurs. I think you know what I'm going to say about this statement. Conflict is all around us, and it's important that we have the skills and the strategies to be able to respond to it in a proportionate and effective way. But let's start with a couple of quick words on negotiation. Negotiation sits at the least formal end of a continuum where conflict can ultimately result in legal disputes and litigation. Negotiation is very much concerned with individuals' values, needs, beliefs, and wants. And as you move along that continuum towards much more formality, litigation clearly is a process that takes a lot longer and is a lot more costly. Where conflict can be resolved by negotiation, individuals retain much more control over the process, and there's a much greater likelihood of a relationship being maintained at the end of it. So let's talk about the situations that are most likely to lead to conflict, particularly in the workplace. This is a broad overview of the types of situations that can lead to conflict, and as you might imagine, task conflict is one that's probably resolved more straightforward and one where there's least likely to be damage to the relationship. Where there's conflict about a given relationship, particularly if it's been over a length of time, or inherent values of an individual, it becomes a much more complex process. It's important that we all reflect on conflict that's occurred in the past, because that kind of self-awareness can help us to predict when it might happen again in the future. Of course, we might know that it's going to happen because situations occur that make it more likely, but also an awareness of your own physiology can be helpful. If you feel your heart beating faster and your palms becoming clammy, then you might be aware that conflict is about to take place or is brewing. And that self-awareness can be helpful because you can then kick in and control emotion and hopefully resolve the conflict in a much more productive way. This quote by cognitive neuroscientist Antonio Damasio really underscores the truth about humanity. We are essentially emotional beings, and we cannot take the emotion out of conversations, out of conflict, out of our interactions. And so it's really important that we prepare and are able to control our emotions and to also manage the emotions of others. So how is communication affected by our feelings and emotions? Is it affected at all? Of course, our communication skills are impacted by our feelings and emotions. I've listed some of the ways here, and every one of them needs to be controlled in order to have a positive outcome from conflict. This is why emotional self-control is so important. You may have come across the concept of System 1 and System 2 thinking by Daniel Kahneman. When we are emotional, we automatically move to System 1 thinking. It happens rapidly, it can be useful in certain situations, but in areas of conflict where thought and care is needed, it can fail us. I want to spend a couple of minutes just talking about Fisher and Shapiro's core emotional concerns. This is a concept that grew out of Harvard Law School, particularly in relation to negotiation in a business context, but I have personally found it profoundly useful in dealing with complex communication with patients and where interactions with other healthcare providers have been challenged. Appreciation is the most important of the core concerns. It involves finding merit in their point of view and expressing that to them in a way so that it builds and strengthens relationships. It can prevent conflict from escalating. Building affiliation involves approaching your differences as problems to be solved together. It can be enhanced by the small talk before the actual conversation, where you find things in common. It can be enhanced by sitting on the same side of the table as opposed to opposite each other, and the use of the pronouns such as we and us. Conflict can often happen when people don't feel adequately involved in decisions that affect them. Dr. Shapiro recommends the acronym ABCD, always consult before deciding, as a way of ensuring that an individual's autonomy has been maintained. In the heat of conflict, people may compete in terms of standing or expertise. It's not surprising if one person starts to say, I'm more of an expert than you are on this, that things can get out of hand and conflict can escalate. The flip side is that you can use another person's standing as a way of improving relationships and dialing down the temperature of the conversation. By asking their advice about something does nothing to remove your standing, but at the same time enhances their status and builds that relationship. We can empower people in a range of roles during conflict management. For example, that can include being a listener, a facilitator, or a problem solver. By using language such as, let's sit down together, work through a range of different solutions and find out which one is most applicable, then we're empowering somebody in the role as problem solver. I did some training with Kathy McDonald, a police hostage negotiator. As you might imagine, it was fascinating, but one of the things that I took away was her concept around dignity and how it must be at the center of all communication. This is across the whole range, whether we're talking about general communication, whether we're dealing with somebody whose emotions are escalating and we have to be careful not to respond in a way that is undignified. And even when we find out somebody is lying or we can call them out on something, doing it in a very dignified way, giving people a way to extract themselves from a situation that maintains their dignity is really important in terms of conflict and finding positive way out of negotiating these areas. When we listen to people, we make connection to them. When people are escalated in terms of their emotion, what comes out of their mouths is going to be the most honest that they will be. And it's a time to be listening particularly carefully, not just to the content of what they're saying, but also to the emotion behind it. And that'll give you clues about which of their core emotional concerns they feel have been violated. It also gives you information about their values, beliefs, needs, and wants. And again, all this information can help you to not only de-escalate, but come to creative solutions with the conflict. Listening also helps us find similarities in what we believe, and that can provide a way forward too. It obviously reduces the emotion and the intensity of the situation, and it ensures that people are treated in a dignified way. Assertiveness is something that for many people is a challenge. We often haven't had official training in how to be assertive, and so it can take many years to reach a point where you feel comfortable. Here's one definition. It makes it sound quite straightforward, but I think having a framework to work to can be quite helpful. Assertiveness can help you ensure that your personal rights aren't violated. It can help you to, in fact, acknowledge the rights of others. It helps you to deal effectively with people who have unreasonable requests on your time, and also it can help you to avoid escalation of conflict. Here's a list of reasons why people might not be assertive. I've spoken about lack of training, but also there are many situations where a lack of awareness that it's okay to be assertive, or in fact important to be assertive. Often there are interpersonal concerns, or people may be vulnerable, or there may be an intimidation because of the seniority of the other person. So in terms of timing of conflict management, which is best? There is absolutely no doubt that spontaneous conflict management is much more fraught. The emotions will be higher, and reaching a situation where you can have a considered discussion is much less likely. I would strongly recommend that planned conflict management is the way to go. DESCI is a framework to help you prepare for the difficult conversations where conflict is present. Attached to this video is a handout that lists a number of example conversation starters or statements that will guide in this process. You begin by describing the behavior or the issue at hand. You then express the feelings within yourself that are occurring because of this. Then you can state the consequences on you as an individual because of what's been going on. Ultimately, then you need to state what change you require and what the consequences will be if that change doesn't occur. You absolutely wouldn't go into a job interview or give a presentation without any preparation. And when it comes to conflict, particularly if it's important conflict that's affecting our lives, it should be exactly the same. It's important to prepare beforehand, to review all the things we've spoken about before. In the handout, there's some other questions you might want to ask yourself while preparing for the conflict conversation that you're going to take on. It's important to prepare some phrases so that they're actually written down and you've practiced saying them beforehand. This can help empower you, and it can help you respond on the fly much better than if you just rely on doing it without the preparation. During conversations about conflict, it's important to be very careful about using you phrases. They can often create a fight or flight response in the other person and lead to escalation. The advantage of I phrases is that, firstly, there's no argument about it because it's about you and they can't call you out and say that it's not true. Secondly, it's not attacking to the other person. The advantage of using we in phrases is obvious. It builds bridges and collaboration. Separating the person from the problem sounds like a positive thing to do, but often it can be difficult to work out how that might look in practice. Here's an example on the slide here, but I've also seen it done in a much more physical way. Two people were having conflict, and one of them described the problem and then went to a whiteboard and wrote down the problem, but then physically stepped away from the board and stood next to the other person speaking about the problem, which was now placed on the whiteboard. And it was a very clever tactic which removed the person from the problem and made it a shared thing that needs to be resolved. When we negotiate with others, often the approach that we use is distributive. And this really means that either one way or the other. A distributive response could be that one person gets what they want, the other one does not. Or it could be, if it's a numerical thing, that we just split it down the middle. It's important when we're dealing with conflict to think of things more in a collaborative way or integrative way. And to do so means actually exploring people's interests rather than their positions. Their position might be the patient in front of you, for example, wants to go home. Her position is, I'm going to discharge against medical advice. But her interest might be quite different. Her interest might be that she needs to go home and feed her dog. And so unless you explore those interests, you're not really going to be able to come up with a solution that can satisfy her needs, getting her dog fed, as well as yours, getting your second troponin. And so by exploring people's interests, you can reach a situation where the negotiation is much more positive and achieves a much more satisfactory solution than if you went to the simple distributive way of dealing with it. When we're dealing in conflict, it's important to acknowledge any positive behaviours in the person opposite us. It's not going to be at the front of our mind, but those small acknowledgements are going to be very positive for moving you forward in terms of the relationship and the communication that you're trying to do. We often think about assertiveness and conflict management as being about achieving the outcomes, of getting what we want. But we don't control the other person. We may not get what we're after. We may end up with nothing more than we had when we started. So where does that leave us? Well, it actually leaves us in a really positive space because we feel more empowered for having been assertive. We have higher confidence, higher self-esteem and self-worth. These are really positive outcomes, and they alone justify the need for assertiveness. Becoming more comfortable with discomfort is a good side effect of assertiveness. You will find that even if you start with small levels of assertiveness, that you will quickly be able to tackle much more complex situations and achieve more than you might have imagined. There are 5 main negotiating styles. We all have a default style that we tend towards, and although that might serve us well for most situations, often it can be useful to understand where we're not strong so that we can build strength in other styles. It's called the dual concern model because on the y-axis is assertiveness, and it's really about self. Are you assertive or not? The x-axis is about how we deal with other people. Is the style one of cooperation or not? Another way of looking at it is whether you prioritize the outcome by assertiveness or whether you preserve the relationship by being cooperative. And as you can see, the combination in this table means that there are varying degrees of both of those. There's no one style which is best for every situation, and it's just about knowing the styles, knowing what you're compromising by selecting one of them, and being intentional about it. As I said, we all have default styles, and knowing what your default style is and knowing which situations your default style might not be the most appropriate one. There might be situations where you're not too bothered about the outcome, and so of course avoiding conflict or accommodating somebody is the appropriate way to go. There can be situations where the outcome is supremely important, and so you will tolerate the damage to a relationship by moving into a more competitive style. Once you understand your own style, then you can make intentional decisions about the negotiation choices that you're dealing with. So we've come to the end. I hope that it hasn't made you so overwhelmed that you want to go and sit on a mountain and never have to deal or negotiate with anybody ever again. So just to summarize some of the things we've discussed, conflict clearly is inevitable. It's all around us and we can't escape it. The techniques we've talked about today will help you deal with that in a really positive way. We know that self-awareness is hugely important, so being aware of when our own emotion is starting to dial up and being able to recognize the emotion in others. I do believe that the Fisher and Shapiro's core emotional concerns are absolutely key in managing any conflict. The importance of keeping dignity at the center, thank you to Kathy McDonald, I think is really an important reminder. Curiosity and an empathy for the perspectives of others will bring you solutions to difficult problems. Assertiveness isn't just about getting the results, it's also about what it brings to you as an individual. You don't need the outcomes to change for you to be empowered and to feel more self-confident. We've given you a framework, the DESCI framework, that will help you prepare your conversations beforehand so you can go in with much more confidence. And finally, it does get easier. There's no doubt about it. There is reward in dealing with conflict in a positive and constructive way, and you're well on the way to doing that now.